everyone. My name is Anita Ehiman, and today I'll be speaking on the topic how implicit bias affects diversity and inclusion in open source. And just a little bit about me, I am Anita Ehiman, like I said, developer advocate at Kivano, a policy engine for Kubernetes, a technical writer, and an open source advocate. And to get into this session, I'd like to tell a quick story. Sometime last year when I decided to become a software developer, I brought up the idea to a family friend, and I asked for the opinion. What do you think of me becoming a developer? Because I'm a microbiologist by career, and I just wanted to switch career paths overnight. And the first questions that I got or I received were, what makes you think you're going to be a competent software developer? I mean, you don't have the basic skills and requirements to become a developer. You're a woman and you're a microbiologist. So what makes you think you can excel in this particular field? And if you look at this question, you'll see that he did not only pick out the fact that I'm a lady and this particular field does not accept ladies, but then he also indicated the fact that as a microbiologist, I'll most likely not have the tendencies of making it in this field as a software developer. But then look at it. At the end of the day, I didn't let those words get to me, but I'm right here. I've actually made it to become a developer advocate, which is amazing. But then imagine the impact of the words that he said on somebody else who actually takes things very personal and take things in a negative way. And that's what we're going to be looking at in today's session on implicit bias and how it affects us in open source. To get into the topic, we're going to look at what diversity and inclusion is, why open source cares so much about diversity and inclusion, what bias means and the different types of biases. We'll look at implicit bias and the types of implicit bias, and then how implicit bias affects diversity and inclusion in open source. And then we'll look at why we should care about implicit bias in the first place, and steps to eliminate implicit bias in open source and amongst ourselves generally. All right, let's start with diversity and inclusion. If you have heard about open source, you must have definitely heard the word diversity or inclusion, or both terms coming together. And a lot of times we talk about diversity, but then how diverse is the open source ecosystem? You might want to ask, because it's written on the documentations, on every documentation regarding open source, you're definitely going to see diversity and inclusion. But then how diverse are we, the contributors and people who are part of this open source community? Diversity is a vast array of human differences, particularly those who have been disadvantaged. Now, this vast array could include people who are tall, who are short, people who are from the east, west, north, and south, people who have different appearances and background, people who are married and single, pregnant or not. Now, it's not just about whether you're a developer or you're a designer. That includes it as well, but then it goes far beyond what we just talk about diversity and inclusion when we're talking about designers and developers. And then inclusion is a system that actively includes and supports these diverse individuals regardless of their identity. So no matter what it is that you have, or like it's like a situation where we let every single person play a major role in the community, and they're comfortable where they are. So a diverse and inclusive environment is one where everyone, regardless of their background, their nationality, their appearance, their race, or whatever it is that they're identified as, feel welcomed and involved and supported in a particular community they are a part of. Now, this is what open source tells us about, that we should always look out at. But how diverse and inclusive is open source? Now, let's look at why open source actually emphasizes on the word diversity and inclusion. Studies have shown that when you put people together in groups to work on a particular task or a particular project, there's high tendency that their productivity and their returns is going to be higher than those who are actually working singularly. And that is actually true, because with more heads comes more ideas and perspective. And one of the reasons is innovation, because when we have diverse thoughts coming together, the different perspectives are always going to bring out new and innovative ideas to, improve that particular community that you're part of. Another is increased productivity. Not only does the project have more ideas, innovative ideas coming in, but then the rate at which work and tasks are being carried out is speed up, because everyone is putting hands to make sure that the project meets its targets. And then we have diversified skills and creativity, because in a place where everyone feels welcomed and appreciated for their skills, we are able to exhibit the best of ourselves and show to the world that, yeah, we can actually be good at something, and we can actually be better at a particular skill set that we didn't know existed within us. And that's another thing that open source is looking out for. And then we have increased profits, because when a project has more hands and more ideas coming in, the target profit that they're actually looking forward to earn will be met in a shorter time, and even increase in amount over time, because there's so many inputs, there's so many ideas, and the project is actually moving at a faster pace. And then it also helps in project outreach, because diverse and inclusive groups helps to spread the word faster. Imagine you're putting together a decentralized project, and the core team of that particular project are from the different regions or different parts of the world, and have different skills and specialties. Now, assuming each and every one of those person tells a friend who tells a friend who tells a friend about a project, that project will most likely have a faster growth rate compared to one that has very little or no diversity at all, so they're just working on their own. And then it also helps with sustainability, because with all of these things we're hoping to achieve from diversity and inclusion, definitely the project's live show is going to be extended over a long time. So, with all of these benefits that open source is looking for in diversity and inclusion, why do we actually still complain that the diversity in open source is not enough, and why are we still emphasizing on it? Because not until not until recently, the open source ecosystem was populated or dominated by the Western male developers. So people of minority groups such as women, people of color, parents, non-technical contributors, gays, lesbians, transgenders, and other marginalized groups, they had very little contributions to make, because not that the opportunity was not there, but then did you feel welcomed enough to contribute? I mean, if I walked into a whole room I where everybody does not actually look like me or act like me, I wouldn't feel like I am welcome in this particular place. And that's one of the reasons. But then the key reasons is because of the biases. So what exactly are biases? These are a prejudice in favor or against a person or a thing or a group compared with another, which actually is considered unfair. And these things are as a result of either our experiences, our society we're growing up from, our past experience with that particular thing or that particular group or that particular person. And there are two types of bias, which are the conscious bias, otherwise known as explicit bias, and the unconscious bias, otherwise known as implicit bias. The conscious bias is one where you're fully aware, you know that yes, I this thing I'm doing is either hurting this person or is making this person not feel comfortable. But I don't care, because I've already told myself that I don't like this thing, and that is it. But then the unconscious bias is the one where you tell yourself that I'm open-minded, I don't believe in this, but then deep down at the back of your head, when you're making the decisions, something always goes wrong while you're making these decisions. And that's where unconscious bias comes in. And it's the most scary one, because you're not aware of it, but then it does so much harm than good. So implicit bias in definition is a social stereotype about certain groups of people that and individuals outside their conscious awareness. And this is as a result of your childhood. This can be as a result of your childhood experiences, the society you live in, words that you were told while growing up, words that you saw either on social media, which whatever it is that the experience might be. A simple example of this would be, okay, while I was growing up, my mom always told me that if I ate beans, I would grow tall. And as a child, I wanted to grow to, I wanted to be like the runway models with long legs and, have all that physique. But I ate a lot of beans. It became my favorite meal. I ate beans almost every day. Look on the bright side, I'm now a 5'4", and I'm not that short. Maybe that's why I got another inch, but I was expecting something better. And right now, if you place beans amongst other meals and you say pick an option, I'll directly go for the meal that is definitely not beans, because I've eaten a lot of beans and I didn't gain anything, or I didn't benefit from anything relating to beans. So right now, the idea that beans is not what I want is just stuck in my head. And this is how we actually get exposed to this implicit biases, either through experiences or things that are happening around us. Now, sorry. Recently, a survey was carried out on GitHub about 5,000 open source projects, and it turns out that 90% of those projects, or 90% of those projects, recorded a higher number of male contributors, with only 10% leaving to people of the marginalized groups, such as the women, the non-binary, the racial minorities, and other persons who are in the computer science field. And you can see that the data actually shows how much bias is going on in the ecosystem. Yeah. So what are the different types of bias that actually exist? Let's look at some of this. We have the halo effect. Now, the halo effect is a tendency, or the positive. The halo effect is considered the tendency of a positive impression of a person to reflect positively and influence our judgments. How do we mean by this? So you heard that someone went to Harvard and another person went to a university that you've never heard of the name. Now the two of them want to come to your team and contribute. The first person you would, like, subconsciously, the first person your mind would tell you to give more attention to would be the person that went to Harvard, because there's so much reputation about Harvard graduates and how smart they are and how much that they know about academic and science and all of that. Yeah. So this is like how halo effect works. You're most likely drawn to the things that you've heard about that person or that particular place or that particular scenario, that you're blinded to what the person has to offer, or what the other person who went to university that you've not heard of has to offer. The opposite of the halo effect is the horn effect, and this is where the negative impression you have about a particular person affects your decisions negatively. Simple example would be, assuming you're staying in a community where someone's father was sent to jail for theft or robbery or whatever it is, either because he's actually guilty of that or he's not guilty of that. Now, fast forward 10 years later, you're in a room with 10 people and an item gets stolen. The first person you suspect will be the person whose father went to prison. And it's actually normal, because we're not conscious of this. We don't know that we're doing it intentionally, but then our mind just directly goes to, if his father stole something, then most likely it exists in their genes. I mean, who actually judges people this way? But well, it's bias and it happens. So it's not you that it's the bad person, or me that is the bad person, but this bias actually goes on. And then another bias to look at is the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is when we favor or choose information that fits with our pre-existing belief. How do I mean? If you look at most sci-fi or most movies that have been acted or put on Netflix these days, this science experts and the geeks are always Asians. I mean, that's a very simple thing. It doesn't look like it's a bias, right? It looks very plain. But in a situation where you're on a team and you assume that the Asians should take the harder part of the task, whereas because they're good at math or they're good at science, whoever made these assumptions though, but the belief is already in the minds of most persons. And in situations like this, we actually treat these people unfairly because of what we've heard about that particular thing, or what. Of course, I'll feel very good about myself if they told me I was good at maths, because I actually suck at maths. But then imagine that you're actually in their shoes and they actually get to take most of the tax because there's a belief that Asians are better at maths. And so whenever a situation that relates to very technical concepts comes up, you hand it over to them. At that point, I would actually not feel good because I want to have fun. I want to take the very minor tax as well, just like every other person. So why do I have to take the very complex ones all the time? That's how unfair this bias can get. Another bias we're looking at is the gender bias, and this is the tendency to choose one gender over another, simply because there's this thought and ideology that a particular gender is superior over another, or another gender is inferior over another. And alarmingly, one study found out that white name white the names that come up whenever they're doing interviews, if there's a male name compared to a female name, they'll definitely pick the male name because there's an assumption that the males will be smarter and be able to like work faster towards achieving the company's goals compared to the females. Whoever made that assumptions, I don't know. And another is when we're voting for administrative roles or positions in offices, and we would always go for the male to take on the leadership role because a woman will most likely be caught up being all emotional and having a lot of feelings, and we need someone who is not very emotional. And that doesn't actually make a lot of sense because you're picking someone based on the fact that you want someone who is a manly figure. What if the woman actually has better potentials than the man that you chose into that particular position, but because you're blinded by the gender, the- you're not able to decide which gender or which person actually is the best fit for that particular role? Then the affinity bias. This is the tendency for people to connect with others and share similar backgrounds or experiences. Typical example is when I'm working on a particular project here, and 10 people are invited into a room. 10 of those persons, among those 10 we have five blacks and five whites, and I am black. For instance, I walk into that room and I'm black. The first person that my mind would tell me to go and have a conversation with would be the person who share the same colors or features as me. So I'll feel more comfortable talking with the person who is of colored skin than a person who's white. And it would be the same thing if the person who walks into the room next would be a white person. He'll be drawn to the white people to, talk to them compared to the blacks. And this happens a lot, especially when contributing, when we see that, oh, this person is a very good contributor, but the white person actually makes a lot of contribution and he's white, his time zone fits with ours, we can contact him better, he will relate with us better and deeper understanding of this project compared to the person of color that is on that particular community or that particular project. And at the end of the day, we pick these persons instead. Another is when we favor someone based on their religion. This happens a lot. You're either a Christian or Muslim or an atheist or whichever one, but then you work on a team or a particular project, and then the person you're supposed to like either favor or not is the same religion with you. There's going to be more favoritism for that particular person compared to other person because the person shares a particular faith that you are looking up to. So you're like, okay, if you share this, then it's definitely you I'll look up to. Now let's conclude, and I'll give another example of me experiencing bias in one way or the other, or giving out exhibiting bias. In a previous conference that I spoke at, a question was asked, and the question says, what happens when somebody is not contributing, but you want to tell the person to either um work on himself or leave the community? And I didn't observe it, but then while answering those questions, it turns out I was referring to the person who asked the question as he frequently. Like I kept on saying the word he should, she should, he should. And it was a week after the conference that someone drew my attention to the fact that I was directing the question to he, whereas the person that actually asked the question was a female. And you see how the bias is. I wasn't conscious of it. Although I'm here talking about bias, I myself have been a person who carried out this bias in one way or the other without being conscious of it. And at that point, I felt terrible because I didn't know that I would be someone who fell for this. But then I did. That's to show you that none of us is exempted when it comes to bias. Every single one of us has a one or two biases that exist at the back of our head that we're unable to get rid of. Then another bias to look at is the name bias. Now, this is where we prefer a particular name because of how it sounds or how similar it sounds with ours, and then favor the person either positively or negatively, and this becomes unfair to that particular person. Assuming you're faced with data or you're handling an application process and the data says that while reading through the names that have been signed up for that particular or applied for that particular process or project, you see names that sound very cool and catchy, and you're like, okay, this name sounds like he's going to have a lot of sense or he's going to be a very smart person. I mean, who imagine his name is Smart Williams, and you're like, okay, if your name is Smart Williams, then you're definitely going to be smart. I mean, and you pick that name over another person's name which you can't pronounce, or it sounds not similar to what you're used to, either not English or not your tribe or whatever it is, but then you pick that person's name over the other names that come up. And that's how the name bias comes. It works in a lot of areas, especially when you're reviewing contributions or you're reviewing people's works in open source, and this happens a lot. You're trying to review a pull request and the name that comes up sounds feminine rather than masculine, and you see that you give more attention to the very masculine name first compared to the very feminine name, and because that's how the name sounds. I think I've actually done this one time, and at the end of the day, the very feminine name turned out to be a guy. Yeah, I did this, and I just remember that I'm also one of the people who fall for this particular name bias. Yes. So by the time I reviewed this particular project and I was done, I was hoping that the person is going to be a lady, but at the end of the day, it was a man. It was a man who had answered a name that was similar to a woman. And you see how the bias blinded my choice and my opinions about that particular person. Alarmingly, one study shows that white names receive 50% more callbacks whenever they do application process compared to African American names. And a separate study also shows that the Anglo names take 80% are likely to receive a calls by 80% compared to the Asian people with Asian last names. And that is very, very true. If you look properly, especially at recruitment processes or at anything that actually has to do with handling the data of people, we always look at names that sound one way or the other closer to us than the rest of the other people in that particular process. Then we have the conformity bias, and this is the tendency to behave similar to other people or groups based on the majority, even if it contradicts your judgment or your opinion. So you're in a team and a particular team member is being voted out of that group because the majority says he's not competent, but this is in contrast with what you believe, and you actually feel this person has the potential if he's given more time. And at the end of the day, you see yourself falling in line with people who are taking, yes, I want the person out of the house or out of the group, compared to people who are saying, no, I want this person to stay in this group. This is because the majority says it, and so the majority should go with the A, right? And it's very common, especially in among team members, amongst contributors, among administrative positions, where we actually hide behind the majority and then shuffle our ideas and our contradicting thoughts against and go in line with just the majority, because the majority takes the yes, so they say. But what if the majority is wrong? What of scenarios where the majority does not actually get the thing right at that point, and they end up hiring someone who does shittier than the person who was pushed out of the group? At that point, you will say, I knew I was right, but you actually knew you were right. How come you didn't reject, or how come you didn't oppose? And that's the bias that took the best of you there. So now that we've looked at all of these implicit bias, I'm sure you must have thought deep down within yourself, do I have a bias that I must have exhibited? Yes, you must have, but they're not probably listed here. I mean, there are countless number of bias out there. They're biased when you actually look or pick out people based on how they look. If this person is very slim, then I'll definitely go with this person because he's slim. I mean, I don't want a fat person on my team. Growing up, there was this discrimination about people who were, fatter or had more weight compared to the skinny people, and that has stuck in the heads of so many persons. I've seen a lot of people discriminate based on appearances, or I'll judge this person, he's very handsome. I mean, if he's handsome, then he should be smart. Whoever actually says that. But then there's a bias that actually relates with that. There are different and countless number of biases, but it depends on what your experiences are, and what's the thought that was left in your head remains, or the stereotype that was left in you remains, and how, and the mind at the end of the day gets very lazy and unwilling to let go of this. We can very defensive of our bias a lot of times. Lots of times we're like, I believe this, so there's no chances, or there are no chances of me changing my thoughts and beliefs about this particular thing. I know that what I know and what I believe is right, even when it contradicts with what is going on, what actually exists. So how does implicit bias actually affect diversity and inclusion in open source? Let's look at this. You'll see that bias affects open source in the sense that it prevents diversity and the culture of open source. Now, we looked earlier at what open source is hoping to gain and why open source cares so much about diversity and inclusion. And you can see that there's so many benefits that come along with a diverse community. But when we exhibit these biases, they stand out to hinder achieving this progress. What we're looking at for an open source is no longer a diverse community, but then a community of people coming together based on either preferences or a particular trait or a particular thing. Now, it's one thing if you're in an organization that does not accept diversity. Of course, there are organizations like that, private organizations, where they say if you're not from this particular place, then you're definitely not going to be a part of it. I think I've applied for a conference once, and they strictly said that if you don't speak Spanish, then you can't apply for this conference. Well, I understand that they're trying to be inclusive, or they're trying to be inclusive to the Spanish speaking race. But what happens to the very few percentage of persons in that I would like to attend that particular conference but don't speak Spanish? Now, what happens to those people? I'm sure they didn't think of it from this perspective. But then if you look at the other end, always look at the other end, you see that there's something wrong with your decisions of preventing the diversity that is going on in that particular place. Then diversity tends makes us to seek out patterns, and this at the end prevents inclusion in the community. So we're looking out for a particular thing. Like I mentioned, they were looking for a Spanish speaking speakers or attendees. Yes, so what happens to those who are not Spanish speaking? And that's the particular pattern that they've chosen. But then other people actually look for other patterns, like you must have this particular certification on your resume. If not, you're not good enough. So what is the determinant factor that certification? I didn't actually just read to pass the certification. I mean, a lot of persons read just to pass a certification. At the end of the day, they can't prove what they got in that particular certification. So, what makes you think that if I have this certification, I'm a better fit for this role compared to someone who has more experience on that particular role or position than me? But we don't look at all of this. So we tend to look at a particular pattern, and this prevents the inclusion that we're looking at for in open source. People don't actually take out the diverse people, or generated groups are not able to feel free and welcome in this particular communities that they're a part of. And also implicit bias creates room for unfair disadvantages. Now we're looking for a diverse and inclusive environment that also, but then we're also looking out for equity. Yeah. So if there's no equity in this community and our biases are taking the best of us, definitely we're going to pass out unfair judgments. We're going to be treating people based on attraction or based on familiarity or based on what we know about them, and not based on fair and equal treatment that open source is looking out for. And these are some of the disadvantages of bias. And you can see that the bias generally is targeting the areas of diversity and inclusion in open source. And this is what we're looking at. If we're hoping to gain or achieve a community that's more diverse and inclusive, then we should learn to get rid of this bias. And how can we do this? Why should we care about bias in the first place? You might be asking. I mean, you're not sure that you actually have a bias, or you're telling yourself that you don't have a bias, that whereas deep down you know that if options are placed, you definitely pick one over the other, and you have a reason why. So why should we care about bias? Because we are humans. That's number one reason. We're humans in the sense that the person that you're exhibiting this bias on, think about a scenario where they actually go home and then digest all that has happened to them. Think of a scenario where they go home and then they realize that with all the qualifications they had, someone else was picked over them because of a race, or because of where they're coming from, or because of where they're located. Think about how that person would feel, and then think about how you feel about yourself for actually carrying out this act on somebody unknowingly or knowingly. You should think about this, and that is why we should actually care, because people are actually going through a lot. People actually go through life changing or life damaging traumas based on the biases that are exerted on them. And also times are changing. The times when we use this bias as our defense mechanism have passed. We can't actually stick to these biases anymore, because at this point it's causing more harm than good. I mean, then people said a lot of things. People said, don't talk to this particular race because of this particular thing. But then the races are coming together to work and build better projects. We've seen all that diversity and inclusion could earn for open source. So why should we stick to our biases and hold on tight to them when we know that it's actually not going to help us in this era? Let's go of those biases, because times are changing, the world is evolving, and we're becoming even more globalized than we thought. And also for community first mindset, open source is also always puts the community first, because everyone and every person is welcome to contribute, to make changes and improve on a particular code base or a project. So if we're thinking of a community first approach, then you should know that diversity, inclusion, and equity are the cause health of a community. And if these things don't exist based on the biases that exist amongst ourselves, then what is a community that we're looking out for? Or what is the community we're hoping for? And also, it affects all of us. You might think this bias does not affect me, it doesn't disturb me. I mean, I'm a very open-minded person. I don't judge, I don't criticize, I go straight to my point. I do this. Yes, we do all of this, but then deep down there's something that you know, that if options are laid out before you, if there are three options laid out before you, pick one person over another, and because of one thing or another. It could be because of their appearances, their race, their nationality, their background, whatever the bias is that you have, either due to your experiences or your encounters with that particular group. It affects you as well. It affects the person who you're exhibiting it on. It affects the community you're a part of. It affects the project that you're working towards. Because if you have all of this standing against the diversity and inclusion in open source, then there's very little or no chance that we're going to attain the goals that we're looking for. Very, very little or no chance. So it affects every single one, from the least to the top of the funnel. It affects every single person in the community, and that is why we should care about this diversity and inclusion and this unconscious bias that exists amongst us. So how can we actually tackle, or how can we deal with this? And the first thing is to be conscious or become aware, learn about unconscious bias. The first step to actually dealing with a problem is accepting that you have a problem. So when we acknowledge the fact that yes, bias exists, I have it one way or the other, I've exhibited it on someone, I've actually carried out a bias on someone, in one way or the other, it will help you to, understand how you can deal with it. Because the first place is understanding the problem, or acknowledge that a problem exists before we can actually take out these problems. And then we should learn and modernize our approach towards accommodation. So by the time we've made it aware that, or we've created an awareness that these biases exist, we should modernize our approach of accommodating contributors and tackling this bias in our project. We can do this either by improving our documentations and making sure that it is clearly stated there that we do not accept any form of bias, and you should always try to check out yourself if you have a bias that you're exhibiting on people. And this can be done by taking the bias test, the AIT tests for bias, and it actually helps the particular community because a lot of persons have bias but they're not aware of it. So we should modernize the approach of accommodating contributors and then work towards how to eliminate some of these biases, and then set diversity and inclusion goals and be intentional about them. Like I said, whenever you see open source, you're bound to see diversity and inclusion. Wherever you see open source written, the next two lines you'd see would definitely have either diversity or inclusion attached to it. And this is because we've said a lot, there's been a lot of theories about open source. I mean, the theory has confirmed that diversity and inclusion is a thing in open source, but then how much action is put towards this? That's the question we should be asking ourselves. How much action is put towards this? And we can actually tackle this by taking action if it involves um accepting more persons from different backgrounds, different races, looking at a more diverse angle. If you think that accepting a pregnant woman to your project is going to slow it down, why don't you create an environment where that particular people who are heavily pregnant can actually contribute even while being in that particular state? If you think accepting a married person on your project is going to slow you down in one way or the other, why don't you look for a way to actually manage or set them on a particular post where they get to deal with their life, their personal lives, but also deal with the project they're working on? If you think having people from a different part of the world due to times and location is going to be a hindrance to the project, so why don't you look for a way to make everything comfortable for both persons? So being intentional about this diversity and inclusion goals is like if another step to eliminate implicit bias amongst ourselves. Then we should let the data inform your decisions. How do we do this? We have database on each community, or every community. Yes, there's a record for the people that are coming in and out of that particular community. Now you should go and look over that data and then see, make sure that the from the top of the funnel down to the list and even at the bottom, there's diversity at every level. Now the leaders of that particular community or that particular project or that particular organization that you're part of, there's diversity amongst them. And then down to the middle, there's also diversity there. And then to the ordinary contributors, or just to the contributors, there's diversity and inclusion existing amongst them. And until you do that, you're definitely not going to have a welcoming environment for people of different races and with people different perspective and ideas. Then we should encourage team members to speak up about their biases. So what is, this is a very difficult part to actually achieve, because not so many people will come to a community meeting where there are about hundreds of persons and mention biases, or come out and say, yes, I have this particular bias, I experience this particular bias, and this is what it costs, or this is how much effect or damage it costs on me. This is not possible. And the only way to achieve this is by setting out working groups or small meetups in that particular organizations that actually focus on diversity and inclusion, where people get to air their opinion and thoughts about the biases that they're experiencing. I'll feel more comfortable telling how much harm that a bias has caused to me in a group of 4 or 5 or 10 compared to a group of 100, because I don't want 100 people to look at me like, well, you're not the only one, or well, some other person has suffered this, because the issue of bias has been going on since we actually started existing as humans. Then we should hold team members accountable, and that is why open source needs the code of conduct. Every open source organization needs the code of conduct, because this will hold each member accountable for their actions. Whenever it's stated that yes, you have to be conscious of this particular thing, because most persons feel this way, or most persons act this way because that's who they are, or that's where they're from. Whenever we're able to do this, or until we're able to do this and hold each member accountable, people will just assume that it's a free world. Since it's open source, anyone comes and goes, you can do whatever it is you like, or you can do whatever it is you like. So using the code of conduct always to lay out what is expected by participants when it comes to achieving diversity and inclusion would be a great place to start as well. Then avoid generalization, because it happens a lot where we generalize or conclude that the participants of a particular event or project are either from this place, or be using this particular kind of softwares, or be speak this particular kind of knowledge, and that hinders a lot of diversity and inclusion in that particular project or event. So avoid generalization. Try as much as possible to see that not only are there other participants, but then you should try to accommodate those participants and make them feel comfortable as well. And with all of these steps, I'm sure we must have understood that bias exists, bias actually lives amongst us. And I hope that this has helped us to understand that being cautious of our biases is a very good way to actually get rid of it. I hope this lets a lot of persons to understand why we're emphasizing on the thoughts and ideas of eliminating these biases that exist amongst us. And to come to a conclusion, I would like to say that the health of any open source community relies on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if we can only achieve this when we let go or set aside all that we've grown up with, all that we've been taught while um, achieving ourselves or developing ourselves, where we let aside all that we've experienced and then learn new things, keep an open mind to, adopting new technologies, new perspectives, new ideas, and learning from new cultures as well. And to that, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. And my name is Anita Human. You can connect with me on Twitter, on GitHub, and on LinkedIn. And do well to ask any questions if you have any right now.